The knock came a little after midnight, and it was so weak, Cora nearly took it for the wind. She'd heard the wind do worse that winter, so she waited. It came again, 3 soft taps, low on the door, like a man who hadn't the arm left to knock proper. When she opened it, the cold came in first, then the man. He half fell across the sill, snow packed in his beard, and he didn't ask about the storm or give his name. He just looked past her toward the stove and asked if it was true that she still had food. Cora didn't answer. She set down the lamp, pulled back the rug by the stove, and lifted the cellar door. Down in the lamplight, the shelves were full. Carrots, beets, turnips, packed in damp sand the way her mother had packed them back in Norway. Enough to last to spring, maybe past it. This is the story of the winter the train stopped, and a town nearly starved, and the one house with a full cellar belonged to the woman they'd all called backward. By April, half of them would owe her their lives. She never did quite forgive them for it. By the fall of 1880, Cora Lindqvist had learned to do everything with her hands a little faster than she used to. She had to. There was no one else's hands on the place anymore. Eric had been gone a year by then. A hayrack tipped on the river road the summer before, and that was that. A strong man one morning, a grave by the church fence by the next. People said the right things at the burial. Then they went home and wondered, quietly, how long the Norwegian woman would last out there alone, 3 children and a half-proved claim. She heard the wondering. She just didn't answer it. What she did instead kept the town talking. While other families sold off their root crops cheap at the end of the season, Cora was buying. Carrots, turnips, beets, by the bushel, more than 3 children could eat in 2 winters. And she wasn't putting them in a bin like a sensible person. She was burying them in sand. Down in her cellar, she had wooden boxes packed with damp sand, and into the sand went the carrots, layer by layer, so they never touched each other and never touched the air. Her mother had done it that way back in Telemark. Her grandmother before that. That was how you kept a root through a long winter in the old country, where winter meant something. To the town, it looked like a grown woman playing in the dirt. It came to a head at Pell's store. Elias Pell ran the only mercantile worth the name, and he ran it the modern way, with tinned goods and a ledger he was proud of. When Cora asked to put a sack of salt and a tin of lamp oil on credit till the wheat came in, Pell looked at her over his spectacles a good while before he answered. "Mrs. Lindqvist," he said, "I hear you've got a cellar full of dirt and carrots. Maybe you ought to live off that." 2 men by the stove laughed. Cora set down the coins she did have, took what they'd cover, and walked out without giving Pell the rest of what was in her head. I'd like to tell you she had some sharp answer ready. The records don't say she did. What we know is what she did when she got home. She went down to the cellar and kept packing by lamplight. She topped off the sand boxes. The apples she set well away from the roots, because an apple will spoil whatever sits near it. Another thing the old women knew that nobody here seemed to. She counted the jars, then she counted them again, and Anna, her oldest, saw that the tally was bigger than anything they could need. "Mama," Anna said, "that's too much for us." Cora didn't look up from the sand. "It will keep," she said. "You'll see." That October, the almanacs were calling for an ordinary winter. They were wrong by about 4 months. The cellar was the first thing Eric dug when they came west, before the house even had a real floor. He went down past where the frost could reach, into the cold that sits in the ground all year and never quite leaves. Cora used to tease him that he'd dug himself a grave with shelves. After the hayrack, she stopped saying that. By October, she had it loaded the way her mother would have known on sight. The potatoes went in the darkest corner, covered over, because light turns a potato green, and a green potato can make you sick. Cabbages she pulled whole, roots and all, and set them head down in a pit of dry leaves. The carrots and beets went into the sand. and over the whole hatch, once the boxes were full, she piled straw and then sod, banking it the way you'd bank a fire to last the night, until you could walk past the cellar door and not know it was there. A root needs cold without freezing, and damp without wet. Down there, 8 feet under the Dakota grass, the ground gave her both, all winter, for free. She didn't have the words for why it worked. She just had her mother's hands and a memory of a cellar in Telemark that fed 9 children through winters that made this country look soft. Her neighbor Ruth Harmon came by on a bright day in late October and watched her bank the door. Ruth had a fine frame house with milled siding and a husband doing well. She stood there a minute, arms folded against the wind, and finally said what she'd come to say. "Cora, honey, you don't have to live like the old country anymore. We've got a store now. We've got the railroad." She said it kindly, which was somehow worse. "The railroad," Cora said, "doesn't run in February." Ruth laughed, the way you laugh at something that isn't a joke, and went home to her milled siding. There was one thing Cora did that even Anna couldn't follow. She set aside a basket of the best, firmest potatoes, packed them apart from the rest, and put them where the children couldn't reach. Seed potatoes for the spring planting. "These we don't eat," she said. "Not if it gets bad. Not if it gets very bad." She said it twice so it would stick. Jens, who was 8 and hungry most of the time already, asked what very bad meant. His mother didn't answer that one. The first snow came on the 12th of October, 3 weeks early, and it didn't melt. By the end of the month, the road to town had gone white and stayed white, and the trains were already running late. The October storm was just the door opening. After it came another, and then they stopped being separate storms and became one long winter that hit every few days, like a man knocking things off a shelf to see what breaks. The people who lived through it argued for years afterward about how many blizzards there really were. Nobody argued about the snow. The railroad held out the longest because the railroad was the whole reason these towns existed. The company sent crews to dig out the cuts, and the cuts filled back in behind them faster than the men could throw the snow. They tried a plow with a string of engines behind it. The drift it hit was packed so hard it bent the plow. Sometime in January, the company quietly stopped trying. No train would reach the town again until spring. Now you have to understand what that meant out there. These were not people with a root cellar from their grandmothers. These were modern families who bought flour by the sack and coal by the ton and trusted the train to bring more. When the train stopped, the counting began. Sacks of flour, tins of oil, lumps of coal in the bin. The coal went first, so they twisted hay, wound it into hard, tight sticks that held a flame a few minutes at a time, and fed the stove all day to keep one room above freezing. When the flour ran low, men brought out the seed wheat, the grain saved for spring planting, and ground it a cupful at a time in little hand coffee mills, because there was nothing left to make bread from but next year's crop. At Pell's store, the modern shelves went bare. The tinned goods and the sacks were gone, and the proud ledger was just a list of credit owed to a man with nothing left to sell. People still came in out of habit, stood by the cold stove a while, and went home with less than they came for. Out at the Lindqvist place, the snow drifted up over the banked cellar door until you truly couldn't have found it. In December, Cora began serving the potatoes with their skins on, and a little less of everything beside them. The children noticed before she said a word. She wasn't counting her own shelves. She was counting how soon the neighbors would be empty. By January, the cold had stopped being the thing people talked about. By January, they were talking about who still had food. And out of habit, or something closer to hope, more than one of them found their eyes drifting toward the place they'd been laughing at since the fall. January was the month the valley stopped pretending. Jens took sick first in the Lindqvist house. Not bad at the start, just a cough that wouldn't clear, and a way of sitting too still by the stove. A hungry child and a cold house will do that. Cora put him in her own bed, under everything they had, and sat up with him, twisting hay to keep the fire going, listening to him breathe. There was a night, somewhere in there, when she thought about giving up. She could load the three of them on the sled and break for town while the wind was down. Other families had. There was a kind of safety in being near other people, even hungry ones. The claim wasn't proved yet. The deed wasn't really hers. And the man who'd talked her into this whole country was a year under the snow by the church. No help to anybody now, least of all her. She got as far as pulling the sled out of the drift. Then she put it back. What turned her around was the cellar. She went down that same night, half to count and half to be somewhere Eric had made, and she put her hand into the sand. The carrots came up firm, cold and damp and firm, the way they'd gone in. The potatoes in the dark corner were sound. Nothing had frozen. Nothing had turned to the gray mush a careless pile turns to when the cold finally finds it. She'd heard, the way you hear things even when no one's visiting, that it hadn't gone like that everywhere. That folks who'd thrown their roots in a heap or stored them too near the surface had gone down in January to find half of it frozen solid and the other half rotted soft. The modern way, the store-bought way. Cora stood in the one cold room in the county where the food was still good and did the arithmetic she'd been avoiding. She had enough. Not just enough to last, enough to last with extra. And 3 miles in every direction, in better houses than hers, children were going to bed on hay-twist fires and a cup of ground seed wheat. She climbed back up the cellar steps, knowing something she couldn't put down again. The knock, when it came, wasn't going to be a surprise. The only question was what she'd do when she opened the door. Ruth Harmon was the first to come. It was full dark, a few days into the worst stretch of the winter, when Cora heard boots on the step and opened the door to find the woman with the milled siding standing there in a good coat that had stopped being warm a long time ago. Ruth didn't come right out with it. She talked about the weather a minute first, and then she ran out of weather. "My 2 youngest," she said finally. "They've stopped asking for supper. That's worse than the crying." She looked at the floor. "I wouldn't ask, but you're the only one who might still have anything." Here was the moment, if Cora had wanted it. This was the woman who'd stood in her yard in October and told her, kindly, that she didn't have to live like the old country. Every root in that cellar was counted. Every carrot Cora handed up those steps was one her own children wouldn't eat in March, and nobody knew yet how long March was going to last out here. Cora stood in the doorway a while, long enough that Ruth started to apologize and turned to go. Then she stepped back and held the door. "Bring a basket," she said, "a small one, and shut it fast behind you. I'm not heating the whole county." She filled Ruth's basket from the sandboxes. Carrots, a few beets, 2 of the sound potatoes, a measure of the salted things. Not a feast. Enough to put supper back on the table for a few days. Ruth tried to say something at the door, and Cora cut her off. "Go home before the wind comes up," she said. That was all. No speech about it. Nothing about who'd been right. Ruth wasn't the last. Word goes through a snowed-in valley quieter than you'd think, and faster than you'd believe. The next night, there were 2 families. Then a man none of them knew well, who'd walked in from the far section with snow packed into his beard and no pride left to spend, asking the same question at the same door. And the part that must have sat strangest with her, among them, before the winter broke, came the Pells. Not Elias himself, he sent his wife. The man who'd told Cora to live off her dirt and carrots had run out of everything in his modern store and sent his wife down the road to buy back, with what coins they had left, the very thing he'd laughed at. Cora filled her basket too. She said nothing about the store, but Anna, old enough now to keep the tally, saw her mother's mouth go to a thin, straight line and stay that way the whole time Mrs. Pell was in the house. The cellar that was meant to feed 3 was feeding 4 families now, then 5, in baskets carried home through the dark. The sandboxes went down faster than the winter did. Cora started cutting her own children's share again to keep the baskets going out, and she moved the seed potatoes one more time, deeper, to a corner even she had to reach for. Not yet. Not those. Not unless it got very bad. What none of them could explain, standing in that warm doorway with full baskets, was the thing that mattered most. Why this cellar? Why hers, and no one else's? Why the backward widow's carrots came up firm in January, when the whole proud towns had frozen black in the ground? The answer had been under their feet the whole time. So here is why the widow had food when the town did not. It comes down to 2 things her mother taught her, and neither one is complicated. The first is cold. A root vegetable wants to be kept just above freezing, close to the cold, but never into it. Let a carrot actually freeze, and the water inside it turns to ice. The ice tears the thing apart from the inside, and when it thaws, you've got mush. That's what happened to the piles people kept in their sheds and lean-tos, up near the surface where the Dakota cold could reach. Eric had dug Cora's cellar deep, down past where the frost goes, into ground that sits a few degrees above freezing all winter long, no matter what the sky is doing. Her food never froze because the earth wouldn't let it. The second is the sand. A carrot is mostly water. Leave it in open air and it gives that water up, goes limp and wrinkled in a week. Packed in damp sand, it can't dry out. The sand holds the moisture against it. And because each root sits alone in the sand, not touching its neighbors, when one does start to go, it goes by itself. It can't pass the rot down the line. Cold without freezing, damp without wet. That's the whole secret the town had been laughing at. It wasn't a charm, and it wasn't luck. It was 1,000 winters of people in a hard country working out exactly how to keep a carrot alive until spring. And a woman stubborn enough to do it their way in a place that thought it knew better. It cost her, though. That part doesn't go in the nice version of the story. By late February, the sandboxes were nearly bare, and there were still mouths at the door. So Cora went to the far corner and took down the basket she'd sworn not to touch. The seed potatoes. Next year's crop, the planting she'd promised her own children they would never eat. She cut the eyes off a handful to save for spring, the barest start, and gave the rest away. Boiled them for other people's children, and for Jen's, whose cough had finally started to ease. She gambled her own next year to get the valley to march. She didn't talk about that either. By the time the wind finally let go in early April, there were families in that valley alive on carrots out of a Norwegian widow's sandbox. The same people who, 6 months before, had watched her bury good food in the dirt and laughed. Nobody was laughing now, but nobody quite knew how to say the other thing either. The first train got through in the middle of May. People walked down to the tracks to watch it come, the way you'd walk down to look at something you'd half stopped believing in. It brought flour and coal and the ordinary world back with it. Within a week, you could buy lamp oil at Pell's again and pretend, if you wanted to, that the winter had been a thing that happened to somebody else. But you can't really pretend that in a small place. Everyone knew whose cellar had carried them to May. Nobody made a speech about it. This wasn't a town that made speeches, but the gratitude came out anyway, in deeds, in things left on a doorstep. Cora had given away next year's planting to get them through, and the valley knew it. So that spring, seed came back to her. A neighbor turned up with a sack of seed potatoes and set them by her door without much of a word. Ruth Harmon brought wheat. Somebody fixed the sag in her barn roof while she was out. And when it came time to put the crop in, There were more hands than she'd asked for in the field Eric had first broken. Pell came too, near the end of it. He stood at the edge of the field a while, turning his hat in his hands. And what he finally said wasn't an apology, because he wasn't built for those. "I was wrong about the cellar." That was it. Cora looked at him, nodded once, and went back to her row. It was as far as either of them could go, and it was far enough. She never did forget who'd laughed. You don't, out there. But she let them put her crop in, and she fed them when they came hungry. Somewhere in there, the two things stopped fighting each other. By the next fall, if you walked that valley at the end of the season, you'd have seen something that hadn't been there the year before. Cellar doors banked with straw and sod. Boxes of damp sand going down into the cold dark in house after house. Carrots laid in careful, the old country way, put down by the same people who would have laughed at the sight of it 12 months earlier. 3 winters later, and 400 miles north, another family would meet a hard winter of their own. That one started with a frozen well and a barn full of animals nobody thought to thank. But that's a story for another night.